Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, October 16th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. Oh gosh, we're only 3 days shy of my 40th birthday. It's a big one. I'm coping, I promise. I'm coping. This isn't about me. This is about my guest this week. So let's just switch gears immediately and dive right in. I am really excited that I had the opportunity to chat with an award-winning environmental journalist and author named Gloria Dickie. Her work has appeared literally everywhere that you read interesting science and environmental reporting. We're talking New York Times, The Guardian, The Atlantic, Nat Geo, Wired, Science, everywhere you can imagine, Pacific Standard. And now she is actually working as a global climate and environment correspondent for Reuters, and she's based in London. Her book is just so fascinating. I love the conversation that we had. It's called 8 Bears, Mythic Past and Imperiled Future. So you're going to know a lot more about bears than you did before the start of this hour. You are going to have so much to say at your next dinner party. So without any further ado, here she is, Gloria Dickie. Well, Gloria, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I am excited to talk about your new book, 8 Bears, Mythic Past and Imperiled Future. It's got that kind of, the vibe that I'm feeling has become quite common on Talk Nerdy, which is the hope, but also the worry. And I think that we'll probably be covering the whole kind of spectrum here. But before we dive into bears, let's talk a little bit about you. So you are a science journalist. Tell me what got you interested in writing about bears? Like, how did you focus on this specific topic?
Yeah, my kind of connection to bear, or like the bear beat, goes back quite some time, almost a decade, I guess. I'd moved to Boulder, Colorado to do my master's in environmental journalism. And there were a bunch of black bears coming into the town of Boulder, which kind of sits along the Rocky Mountain Front Range there. And, I was kind of, going to city council meetings and kind of observing what was happening in town as a student and a reporter. And there were some citizens who were trying to get this ordinance passed to require bear-proof garbage bins because the bears kept getting into trouble. So that was kind of my first run-in, I guess, with black bears, and that became my kind of master's thesis, and that kind of just kept snowballing, over the years to get to like Yellowstone grizzly bears, and then polar bears, and then all 8 species of bears eventually.
I love it. And so you've been writing, for a bunch of different outlets, but are you on staff at Reuters?
Yeah, I'm on staff now at Reuters News Agency after almost 8 years as a freelance environmental journalist. Yeah, so the book was kind of reported before that, and then I joined Reuters at the start of last year.
Oh, I love that. That's super cool. And so is this your first book? I mean, you've written obviously about a lot of different topics for a lot of different outlets, but is this your first full-length foray?
Yeah, it is my first book. And I think, books take a long time to do, right? People think, it's like 1 to 2 years and you're like, oh no, this was like at least like a 5-year project for me. So while I was freelancing as a journalist, I was also working on the book and kind of picking up little stories along the way. Well, that kind of overlapped with my reporting on bears.
I'm loving this because I'm just noticing in the in some of the promo materials that I've gotten from your publicist on the book, the 3 quotes right at the very top are from 3 authors that have been on the show before.
Sure.
So we've got Nate Blakesley, Ben Goldfarb, and Michelle Nyhouse, all of whom I've interviewed. So yes, good company here. I think that this is a match made in heaven.
I feel like the animal writing, environmental writing world is actually super small, and everyone kind of knows everyone. So that does not surprise me.
Yeah, I've always been surprised that actually just the science writing world in general, whether we're talking about environmental journalism, animals, or kind of moving over into like math and physics, and I don't know, there's so much crossover.
It's
I feel like
super niche. It's super niche. Yeah.
Well, I love it. Okay, so we're going to talk about bears. We're going to get into it. So bears. Okay. Yeah, I always do this on the show. I always think at the very top, like, what is my kind of connection to the subject matter? What do I know? I had an experience. Let's see, bears. I had an experience once where I was visiting a friend in Carbondale, Colorado, and we were at, oh gosh, it was that movie. It was the movie Contagion. So this is a long time ago. We were at the
before the real
movie.
pandemic.
Before the real one. Yeah. Although I do remember it's the same kind of thing where like somebody would cough in the movie theater and everybody was like, you know. But we were watching Contagion in the movie theater. And then when we got out of it was a very small theater. We got out of the movie and like the usher person in the lobby was like, wait, there's bears in the parking lot. We're like, okay. So we all just had to like hang out until the bears left. And I
Oh
was like, is
God.
this normal here? And they're like, yeah, kind.
That's so small town Colorado. I love that. I love that like everyone has a weird bear story. I think that that's one of the things that's been like the most exciting about the book is like just all the random bear encounters people share with me.
So tell me, I mean, I think a lot of people have had encounters, and well, people who live in areas where bears are close by, at least of the listeners of the show who are very likely living in the US, UK, or I don't know, most English speaking listeners, although we have listeners all over the world, but specifically in the US, most people have had run ins with black bears, but black bears aren't the only kinds of bears. So why don't we start with like a top line? What are the eight bears?
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point because most people are surprised that there are only 8 bears, but then when you try to get them to name them, they can only name 4 anyway.
Yeah.
So yes, the American black bear, of course, is the most common bear in the world. There's nearly 1 million black bears, so that's what most people know. And then also in North America, you would have the brown bear, which the grizzly bear is a subspecies of that. Most people think the grizzly bear is its own species, but it's a brown bear. And then you have the polar bear, of course, in the Arctic. And those are the 3 species that appear in the US and Canada. And then looking further afield, we do have bears, in Asia and South America. So you've got the sloth bear, which lives on the Indian subcontinent. You have the moon bear, or the Asiatic black bear, as it's also known, which lives in Asia. The sun bear, which is the world's tiniest bear. It looks like a little small dog. And that lives in the tropical forests of Southeast Asia mostly. And then you have the panda, of course, which people also know. And it is a bear. Some people think that's not a bear. And then lastly, you have the spectacled bear, which lives in the cloud forests of the Andes in South America. And that's the continent's only remaining bear species today.
Mm, okay. And so I'm just like pulling them all up so I can see them all while we talk. So I've got to see pictures. I've got to be visual here on the podcast. I've seen a sun bear before in a zoo.
If you Google sun bear tongue, I highly recommend that. They have a 10-inch long, like fruit roll up, crazy tongue. It's quite wild.
Whoa, I'm seeing it. Wow, incredible. So yeah, I've seen obviously the first 3 that you mentioned, as you mentioned, most people are going to be aware of, and a panda, of course, most people are aware of that. And I wonder if the reason that people don't know if panda is a bear is because they've been like, it's been seared into their minds that koala is not a bear. And so they're like, oh, I don't want to make the same mistake with a panda.
I think it's the red panda connection as well, because red
That would make
pandas
sense.
are not bears, right? But they just get kind of like mixed up, and they're like, and to be fair, we actually did not know that pandas were bears until the 1980s when they could do DNA testing. So there was a long time, there's a pretty long held belief that like the panda, we didn't know what it was and it wasn't a bear. So it could be that.
Yeah, that is very confusing. The way that we have named things historically, and then those common names, they stick around, even though they're not very in keeping with taxonomy.
Even the sloth bear, like it's not a sloth, it is a bear, but it's still called the sloth bear, right? So very
it's confusing. Like the raccoon dog. That one confuses a lot of people, I think. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, I'm looking at the sloth bear too. So obviously bears, Ursin, Ursinus, Ursa, that's going to be part of their name. Is every bear have an Ursa Latin kind of connection?
I think there's
giant panda doesn't.
It doesn't. It's like an Ire-po. Yeah, it's like the weird Latin. Sorry, do not give me a Latin quiz.
It's fine. I'm just like, hey, Google. It's interesting.
Which is, I think, the large. I have it all in the book. It's like Ursus, Ursivus, and then like the panda is the oldest bear lineage, so it's a slightly different lineage. So yes, there's tweaks to the Ursa world, I guess you could say.
So pandas are the oldest lineage. Is that why they're so kind of, well, I would say, is that why they're so wildly different from the others, but they're all really different from each other.
They're all pretty different. Like actually the moon bear or the Asiatic black bears was quite similar to the American black bear. They're very closely related, and polar bears evolved from brown bears fairly recently in terms of like evolutionary terms. So yeah, I mean, but you know, you wouldn't think that the polar bear and the brown bear were closely related. So yeah, the pan.
Also, I think I had somebody on the show a while back who like specialized in Pisleys. And so
Oh,
I guess I
okay.
knew they were related because they can mate. And if they
Yeah.
couldn't mate, yeah, if they weren't too closely related, they wouldn't be able to have offspring.
Exactly. I love a Pizzly bear. Yeah, no, it's a fertile hybrid offspring. And they can just keep mating and creating more and like diluting the the kind of polar bear gene pool or whatever as they go along. So
Ah, it's
yeah.
fascinating. Yeah, polar bear, grizzly bear hybrid, which I guess because they do overlap, like their territories do overlap up north, right?
They do, and then well, that's the interesting thing with climate change is that we're seeing brown bears, moving higher into the Arctic and overlapping more with polar bears. So
Oh, fascinating. Gosh, there's so much. I'm jumping all around. There's so much. So, how do you even begin to approach? I'm curious how you organized your thoughts on the book. Were you like, okay, I'm going to go 8 bears. I'm going to divide it by 8. I'm going to talk about each one separately. I'm going to go in chronological order. Like, how did you
yeah.
approach that?
I wanted to do like a bear by bear style from the get go. That just seemed like the easiest to me. I think the challenge with that is how do you avoid having like 8 different chapters that just feel like their own like magazine story in some ways. And then I did also have some agents push back and say, no, like we would do this book, but we'd want it to be like thematically organized. So like you would have multiple bears per chapter around a threat theme. So like climate change and then habitat loss. But to me, that just felt like super messy and super challenging to do it that
And
way.
depressing, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah, right. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of the environmental journalism beat these days, anyway. So no,
Yeah.
I did kind of go bear by bear, and then I kind of, I guess, within that, arranged it by geography. So it's not, I guess it kind of reads as though it's like I did not do like chronologically quite how the book is set up. I bounced. I think my first bear was the black bears, right, and then brown bears, and then I did pandas, and then the last bear that I actually did was the spectacled bear, which is the first bear in the chapters. So yeah, you're kind of
Right,
bouncing
because it's sort of
around.
all around. It's sort of all alone in South America. So maybe we should go the same way. I mean, probably most of the listeners of this show are going to be the least familiar with the bears that you talk about first. So maybe we should do that too. So like the spectacled bear, which you mentioned is a South American bear, and I'm looking at it right now, and it is weird looking.
I think they're pretty cute though. They're kind of like stocky. But yeah, but let's start with like the lesser known bears. Because one of the things that I did want to do with this book too was to try and get some attention to some of those unknown species. Because I feel like, polar bears and grizzly bears, they get so much attention, but then there's all these other very threatened bear species that just don't really get the limelight so much. So yeah, I can talk about the little spectacled bear if you like.
Yeah. So is it really small?
It's smaller. It's like I think it's on that's in the groupings. It's more of one of the small ones. I guess little is maybe it's very gentle. So maybe that's why I'm thinking like, oh, it's like
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, so
it,
you're almost thinking of it as being less, I
a
guess,
nice little bear.
intense. Yeah,
Yeah,
nice little bear. Yeah. And so I'm looking right now, the spectacled bear is considered on CITES, at least it's considered um vulnerable.
yeah. So
Okay.
6 of the 8 bear species are considered to be threatened with extinction in some way, and it's that kind of ranges. It's a little scientists aren't completely sure quite how many spectacled bears are left, and a lot of bears are very hard to count. Even in North America, bears can be really hard to count. But so for a lot of these species that aren't as well known and that don't even have the funding to do these really expansive kind of bear hair snag studies, it's really tricky to know exactly how many spectacled bears are living in the cloud forest in the Andes. But they are considered to be quite threatened by encroaching agriculture, mining, and on the horizon is of course climate change, which these bears live in, as I mentioned, the cloud forest, which are these really special and unique tropical forests that basically are kind of moisturize. They get their water from the clouds that float through up the mountain slope, and that's where these bears often live. But because of climate change, that kind of cloud immersion point is shifting upslope, and eventually you kind of just go off the top of the mountain, right? So there's a lot of concern that these bears will be losing their habitat, and at the same time, they don't seem to be able or willing to use the Amazonian lowlands. They're not, for some reason, they're not moving further down, despite the fact that you would think there's lots of food. Why can't they just shift down? But they're finding that so far they don't seem to like that ecosystem. So that's kind of a big question mark for scientists.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So it's like you that's actually a really interesting question from an evolutionary perspective in general, because we talk about pressures, right? There are these environmental pressures, whether they're human made or not, that are sort of put onto an organism, and then the organism's ability to sort of adapt to those pressures and continue to make viable offspring is its measure of fitness. But we use like this word ability, but like you mentioned with the spectacled bear, is it unwilling to? Is it unable to? Like, what is it about these pressures that it's sort of not bending to them and it's just going to be continually crunched? It's fascinating to kind of try and get in the mind of a bear and say, did they try and they said, no, not for me? Or is there just an incapacity to do so?
Yeah, I mean, especially because bears they're often considered to be incredibly flexible in like their behavior and their diet. They eat a ton of different things, right? They eat fruit, they eat nuts, they eat meat. So, the Amazon has tons of fruits, it has tons of food. So it's like, well, why don't they want to be in that area? And one of the theories is, well, you kind of have like other kind of like mesocarnivores. You have other like largish animals, jaguars and things that are inhabiting those lowlands. So maybe they don't like to live with those animals, right? They kind of have their niche and they don't want to be with the big cats or something like that, right? But yeah, it's interesting. It's like the behavioral aspect that we don't always consider of when thinking about animals.
Yeah, and I mean, we also think of bears in general, at least we're probably usually talking about black bears when we mention this, but in general, of bears as being not just flexible, but like deeply intelligent. Like, I know we'll get to the black bear, but there's that kind of famous quote from the park ranger who was asked why you can't design like a good bear proof, garbage bin or like bear box. And they're like, well, because there's like a lot of overlap between the dumbest human and the smartest bear.
Yeah.
Like, they can obviously make these things that are too hard for bears to figure out, but then humans are like, man, it's broken. I don't
Yeah.
get it.
I
Yeah.
mean,
So
like, confession, like even I struggled in Yosemite. It took me like 20 minutes to figure out how to like put my food away in like one of the bear bins. And they're like, oh yeah, they figured those out already. I'm like, oh well, that's humbling.
yeah. Yeah. So we think of them as being like intelligent and flexible, yet we don't know. We can't get into the minds of these animals. All we can do is look at their behavior after the fact and try to make sense of it.
Yeah, yeah. So the spectacled bear is kind of, I mean, I guess for other kind of like fun facts, it spends a lot of time up in the trees. So it's like often making these little
Okay.
kind of like tree nests by bending the branches towards it. And then it just, stays up there for, hours, days, kind of eating, apophytes, which are different plants growing on other plants, bromeliads, which is the pineapple's a bromeliad, but like this whole family of these really kind of funky looking plants. But yeah, again, yeah, just losing habitat kind of left, right, and center. So
And are they I'm just curious, kind of maybe we can talk about all bears in this conversation, or maybe we can go bear by bear, but are they omnivorous? Because you mentioned that they eat plants, but don't most bears also eat meat?
that's a very good question. So they mostly do eat plants. They might scavenge, cow carcasses from like some agriculture in the area, but they are largely like herbivores. Now, the bear diet is very complex, and I think that most people assume, especially from kind of doing this book tour and talking to people, I would say a lot of people assume that bears eat a lot more meat than they actually do. Most bears are pretty like berries, forbs, nuts, things like that. I think where you do see a bit more of meat, and it can kind of vary within populations, like where they live. It can vary between male and females. So I think it's Yellowstone, for example, where the female grizzly tend to eat a lot more berries, whereas the male grizzlies would eat more meat. The only bear that's like super carnivorous is the polar bear, which of course is pretty like an obligate predator of seals and seal blubber, out of necessity because it's such a harsh environment. And then like the sloth bear, that bear mostly eats insects. It's insectivorous. And then some bears, they eat like honey, figs, tropical fruits. Moon bears also pretty varied, a bit more meat with them. So yeah, I think it really varies. But I would say overall, I think people overestimate just how much like meat bears eat compared to say like wolves and like big cats, which tend to be a lot more carnivorous than bears.
Yeah, it is interesting that we sort of have that, I guess, misperception. Do you think it's because of sort of popular, like basically like popular conceptions of grizzly bears as being these like really aggressive, kind of predatory creatures?
That's what I would think. Like, I think it has to do with like the media portrayal of grizzly bears and like attacking people. And it's like people are assuming maybe that like the bears want to eat the people.
Right. Yeah.
Like that doesn't typically happen. I mean, we have seen, and actually pretty recently this year, we've seen some predatory attacks. There was a man who was killed in a predatory black bear attack in Arizona in June.
Oh, black bear. Interesting.
Yeah, which is a super uncommon kind of like, when black bears do attack, it does tend to be more predatory, whereas brown bears, it tends to be more defensive. So there's like all these like little like kind of like tweaks to like which bear you're dealing with. But in general, like they don't, they're not killing people to like eat them.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of what I think most people think. We think of black bears as like, oh, you didn't realize, but you were getting too close to the babies or something, and that's why they attacked. But that grizzly bears are just like, I want to eat your face. None of that's true.
Yeah.
Huh?
No, well, it's so funny with like black bears though too, and I think that like that was what fascinated me is like they're so, on this like 90% of the time they kind of are like these like oversized, lovable raccoons, right? Like we're all watching these like videos of them playing in the pool, of them playing in hammocks,
sitting on picnic tables. Yeah.
I know, right? Like it's hard to imagine, but then like it's this completely different iteration compared with like the predatory black bear, which is like completely terrifying. So I think like, and not knowing like, what are you going to get? Are you going to get like the cute, fun hammock bear? Or are you going to get like the bear eating your face, as you just said?
Yeah. I don't know why, but I feel like The Revenant kind of fucked most people up. I think a lot of our conceptions of like grizzly bears comes from that horrible scene in The Revenant. And so I'm just curious, is that like, I don't want to say is that common because I know it's not common, but like that happens sometimes?
It's so someone asked me the other day, like, how realistic was the Revenant attack?
Right.
And there's this great YouTube video that I watched recently where they have a bear biologist breaking down like 7 movie bear attacks based on how realistic they are. So like, go watch that.
I love that. That's
amazing. I mean, it's a horrifying attack. I was very traumatized by watching. There's this movie that's kind of like a fringe horror movie called Backcountry. And it's based on a real life event where like this couple was stalked, and I think one of them was killed by a black bear in Ontario, Canada, back in like the 90s. And so this is kind of like the movie version of that. And there's a really horrific bear attack in that film. I think it's also because like they're camping. Like if you go camping, you can like relate to that fear of
scary.
It's just it's so horrendous. And I'm just getting to like my own like bear trauma now. But
do you when you camp, do you camp with bear spray?
Yeah.
You do.
I think like people have asked me like, does this like did working on this book make me like more or less afraid of bears? Because a lot of people are quite afraid of bears, right? Like it's a pretty common fear, and I would say like slightly like more. Like if it's funny. I landed at the Missoula, Montana airport a few weeks ago, and they have this giant grizzly bear like taxidermied in where you're waiting for your baggage. And you're just kind of like, it's like 10 feet tall, right? You're just like looking at that and you're like, oh my God, like I cannot imagine like encountering this in the wild, like camping. So yeah,
that would be horrible.
It's made me like understand their behavior more, but I definitely take bear spray with me. Like, and also just like, ideally if something happens, you're saving your own life, but you're also saving a bear's life too, right? So
that's true. And I think, maybe this is going to be a separate conversation for each of the bears. Like we had been talking about the spectacled bear, which is hanging out up in the cloud forest, up in the Andes. But then like we think about, let's say, a lot about like black bears and sort of human wildlife conflict. Where are people and bears interfacing the most? I'm sure that this is becoming more problematic with almost every single species because of habitat loss. But where are we seeing the most conflict, and what is it about? Is it about getting too close to their dens? Is it about, like you mentioned, like some agricultural stuff, like predation, or maybe like conflict with people's cattle? Like, what have you come across from that perspective that seems to be the most disconcerting with bears?
So we're seeing like the most kind of human bear conflict, not just encounters, but conflict with the sloth bear in India, which
Okay.
is kind of makes sense, right? Because the sloth bear lives near like millions and millions of people. They're living in really close quarters where land, is in short supply, and everyone kind of needs their piece of it. So you have people who need it, businesses that need it, wildlife that needs it, and not just the sloth bear, but you also have tigers, you have leopards, you have all these really big charismatic animals in like this shrinking wilderness. And so the human population is large. The bear population, maybe 40,000 sloth bears. Again, they're not quite sure. But what you do have is you have all these little rural villages, kind of throughout India. The sloth bear lives in, I think, 28 states in India. So
Oh,
it's very
wow. Okay.
widespread. And then
Yeah.
what you have all these kind of forest dwellers or tribes in some cases. Some of them are kind of ethnic local minorities. And what's happening is these people are going into this kind of buffer zone around protected areas to gather things like mushrooms, like firewood, like tendu leaves for cigarettes, like mawa flowers, which they use to make this liqueur from. And often they'll be kind of like shuffling along. They're looking down to the forest, and a sloth bear is doing the exact same thing. And sloth bears they're very aggressive bears, and scientists aren't quite sure why that is, but they do live with tigers. So there's a thought, well, they've evolved to be very aggressive because they have to defend their cubs from tigers.
Oh,
So
right.
often
Because
we're
they're
seeing,
they're
sorry, go ahead.
insectivores, right? Like they mostly just eat bugs.
Yeah, they don't want to like eat the people they attack, right? But they are so
Right.
irascible that if they're surprised and if they see a threat, like they kind of just go like beast mode on it. So we
Whoa. Okay.
see, India they don't track like fatalities and attacks at a national level, but you do have state statistics. And I kind of got turned on to what was happening with sloth bears just through Google alerts because as a bear nerd, I had set up like a Google alert for the word sloth bear, and I kept getting like every week I was getting these Google alerts about people being attacked by sloth bears, and it continues today. I just constantly get these local Indian newspaper articles about sloth bears attacking people. So yeah, we could say it's like, they're attacking, hundreds of people per year, dozens are being killed. You have incidents where multiple people are killed by one bear at the same time, which is like almost unheard of in North America. So it's kind of like that desperation of the people who need like kind of subsistence level, um, collecting subsistence level goods versus like the bear living in these buffer zones and kind of being forced into conflict with people.
And so do you see, it's always really interesting when we think about animals that are protected. If this animal is protected in India by the government, what happens when there is human wildlife conflict? Like, do people often take matters into their own hands? Are they often killed in certain regions? Are they poached pretty regularly? Or like, what is sort of I don't know, the culture around the relationship to these bears?
We do see a lot of revenge killings of these bears, right? Whether it's attacked someone or whether they're just afraid it will attack someone and there's a bear near a village. We're seeing electrocutions, we're seeing poisonings, we're seeing like mobs chasing these bears. There was a video that just popped up yesterday for me about like the sloth bear market in Gujarat that was like kind of chased by a mob of men. And that's a concern because it could, again, these are bears that are considered to be threatened, so that could have an impact on populations, if you have enough of these incidents. At the same time, like I would pay attention to the fact that, in North American styles of wildlife management, if a bear so much as like swipes at a dog, or like it just comes back too many times, we tend to kill it. So I think like they're a lot more tolerant of these animals that can be very, very aggressive and vicious in many ways than like your Westerners are.
Yeah. I'm also curious because something that we haven't gotten into yet is the attempts at historically, and even I think to this present day, the attempts at domestication using bears in circuses, using bears for entertainment. And obviously, I think similar to what you just mentioned, like our Western lens can be very biased because we have done this in the West of for a very long time, and we continue to do it in areas which is kind of not okay. But I'm curious about the sort of like wildlife tourism and the entertainment industry around some of these bears and sort of their quote, I don't want to say domesticability, but maybe their tameability.
Yeah, so I guess one of the main kind of examples of this that, somewhat persists is the dancing bear in India. Nepal and soft bears are dancing bears. Most of those bears in India have now been moved into sanctuaries, but a dancing bear is essentially, they take these cubs from the wild. They often kill the mother to get the cubs, and then they put a rope through the muzzle, and they train the bears to, quote unquote dance by like putting them on hot coals, doing kind of like things that would injure their paws to get them to go up on two legs. And then they can do a little dance, right? But obviously they're not dancing, they're like in pain. And then eventually they just respond to a trigger. So they do this behavior. We have seen most of those bears being rescued now and being moved into, some really great sanctuaries. I visited one near Delhi. Some of that has moved over the border to places like Nepal, where it continues. But at the same time, yeah, like there is a long history of like bear entertainment throughout much of Europe and Britain. We had like bear pits, bear gardens. You had the gladiator games. There were so many different ways that bears showed up in European culture, doing very similar things for like hundreds of years. And it's only within, maybe the past 150 years that that's really shifted. So yeah,
Yeah.
we're definitely not blameless.
Is there any place where it's still a pretty regular practice, or have most sort of cultures across the globe really caught on to the fact that this is harmful?
In terms of entertainment, like in Europe at least, like Romania was kind of like one of the countries that I guess endured the longest, but even as of kind of the 90s, that's come to an end. You do still occasionally see these dancing bears popping up in parts of Asia, but that's mostly been tamped down now. Of course, you do have bears, and I guess in other forms of entertainment, right? There's the panda breeding centers in China. There's pandas in zoos. There's, wild polar bear tourism up in Churchill. There's all different kinds of ways that we still experience and like use bears for entertainment, but perhaps in a slightly less exploitative way. And then there's
Yeah,
also there's the bio bears too, which I'm sure we'll get into, but that's a different
yes. No,
exploitation.
let's move into that next because I do want to take some time to talk about zoos, but I want to wait to get to that. So yeah, let's talk about the bile bears. Tell me.
Okay, sure. So bile bear, not a species. The bile bear is very sad name, but it's typically moon bears and sun bears that are being used for their bile, which is stored in the gallbladder, which is believed to have special properties in traditional Chinese medicine. And so this kind of bear bile substance has been, used for hundreds, if not thousands of years across Asia. But what's changed is that beginning in the 1980s, they used to be that you would just poach a bear, you'd cut out its gallbladder, you'd get the bile, and you have a dead bear. But beginning in the 1980s, the thinking went, actually, we could keep the bears alive and we could continue to harvest through various surgical interventions and mechanisms. We can continue to harvest the bile from the galls of living bears, which in
Ugh,
some ways
so
is
like
much, much worse.
so yeah, like they put like a catheter or something in there and literally just like drip it out.
Yeah, exactly. The techniques like vary from country to country. China is the largest kind of bear farming country, and it's legal there. And they kind of use that catheter style method using gravity to like, drip the bile out. Of course, the bears often get like terrible infections and like,
Of
they're
course.
suffering
Yeah,
terribly.
and they probably have to be kept in cages to do this too.
Yeah, they're typically kept in these cages that are so small they can't even turn around. So they're kind of like the living dead, they're just being fed like mushy porridge to basically keep them alive, but like they're basically immobilized. It's hostage. It's quite awful.
And this
Vietnam.
this isn't some like life-saving, it's like when we first were trying to figure out how to make synthetic, insulin, and we were, required to this is literally like makes my dick bigger, right? Like that's what we're talking about here.
Not so it's complicated. So not the ways that most people are using bear bile tends to be for like headaches, colds, sore joints, very kind of run of the mill ailments. Now, I'm going to pronounce the Latin for a minute here. But so within bear bile, there's a special kind of active ingredient known as ursodeoxycholic acid, and urso for short to make things simple. And so most mammals have ursodeoxycholic acid in their bile pool, but bears have a lot more of it. And so scientists have actually found that this urso acid does seem to hold some really promising potential for treating neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's, Lou Gehrig's, Huntington's, because it's thought that it's kind of the urso levels surge during hibernation to prevent apoptosis, so to prevent cell death when bears are hibernating.
Interesting. Okay.
So there is a medicinal truth to what's in the bile, and perhaps that's why like it's persisted in Asia. Like I think it would be naive to think that they hadn't noticed that there was some sort of impact, right? It's just perhaps that its use has since been watered down to only being used for like very, run of the mill issues. But it could potentially treat much more serious issues. But at the same time, they can also create synthetics from that. So you don't need to use real bear bile. So basically, the long and short of it is, no, we don't need bear bile for modern medicine.
Ugh, it's just so sad. I don't know the what is it? The alternative medicine, the traditional Chinese medicine sort of black market in animal parts is it's just devastating to these organisms. And obviously it's not just bears and bear bile. You see this across so many different species. And I don't know, like you mentioned, like sometimes there is some sort of kernel of truth to the some sort of compound that you can find in there, but so often this folk medicine is like misapplied, or it's sadly there is like a whole, I think, industry of like impotence medicine that has just like become this mystical kind of level of properties, but we know that it just doesn't work, and a lot of animals die in the process, and it's, I don't know, it's heartbreaking to me.
And the thing with bear bile too is like there's obviously this animal cruelty aspect, but there's also concern for wild bear populations because they're getting the bears for the farms from the wild. They're not breeding them. It's very difficult to breed bears in a farm-like setting. So they're taking wild moon bears, wild sun bears, and putting them on farms as cubs, and then they're kind of kept in these really tiny cages. So you're also having an impact on a threatened wild animal too.
And then I think just like with most, whether we're talking about a food source or a medicinal source, oftentimes there becomes this weird like purist mentality of like, oh, but the wild ones are better, and then people pay more for those. And then it just like promotes, a sort of poaching culture.
Totally. Yeah. Someone asked, they're like, can we just use, synthetic versions of it? And like, it just spikes demand for like the pure form of it. Right. So it's not a good kind of economic solution, unfortunately, to a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I think we've seen that a lot with rhino horn, and we've seen it with elephant tusk, and like all of those different. It's like all the different attempts. They just, yeah, they drive new weird markets, and it's, I don't know, it's just heartbreaking. Okay, interesting. So we've got, I want to talk about zoos. I don't want to run out of time before we can talk about zoos. So I'm super curious as an environmental reporter, what your personal take is on zoos, because I hear different things from different people. I think my take so far, which is like not quite as educated, is like it's complicated because zoos can have a very important conservation component to them, or they can be an important part of the conservation puzzle. But zoos historically were like circuses, right? Like zoos came out of circus law.
Yeah. It's so funny how divided the response on this question is, even within like environmental journalists and like people that I know, like friends, where like we don't like have the same viewpoint on this at all. I think that I probably side more with what you just said. Like, I think it is complicated. I think, you know, I think a lot of zoos do like really critical conservation work. San Diego Zoo Global, right? Like they're one of like the biggest players. I think I guess part of it too is like this there's kind of like a purist approach to zoos too, where people assume and obviously and also there's variation between zoos too, right? Like there's different like certifications and metrics, and it's like sure, like roadside zoos, there's different levels of like how good a zoo is. But I think
Right, like the Tiger King, like that's not a zoo.
right,
Yeah,
exactly. Whereas like the Toronto Zoo
like
or like the San Diego Zoo, like
yeah.
that's a very different thing in many ways. But I find that there's like this purist mindset that people have of like the Anthropocene, I guess. And it's like, oh, this animal is in a zoo, but like it could be out living this like phenomenal life in the wild. Like it should be out there. And I'm like, have you seen the wilderness lately? Like
Mhm,
it could also be
yeah.
in a garbage dump, it's like this idea that like if it weren't for in the zoo, it'd be in like this pristine, untouched habitat. The
Which it's actually the
reality,
opposite a lot of times. Like if it weren't for the zoo, that because aren't there some animals where like that's the last remaining one, or like there's not that many left, and they're only extant because they live in zoos.
yeah, exactly. There's like these kind of insurance populations happening in zoos, and I can get that. Like, of course, it's like sad on like an individual level, but the idea that like the alternative is like this perfect, pristine wilderness, I think, is not so accurate now. Even when I was in India, like looking for sloth bears, I went to like the tiger reserves, and like I was really struck by like how much like a zoo it kind of felt. Like it did not feel like wilderness. And you watch these nature documentaries, and there's no people, there's no roads, like all these things have been removed. That's just like not reality. And so I think people have kind of a distorted view of the options for wildlife today.
I think that's like that just really bears repeating. Like I've had such similar experiences. Mostly, I haven't traveled much in Asia, but I've spent a lot of time in Africa. And most of my experiences is there when people are like, "Oh, we're going to like go out into the bush, or we're going to go out into like the wild." And it's like, yeah, but these are all still conserved spaces. They might be large, but they're generally like if there's lions there, they're going to be fenced. Leopards can't be fenced, but like lions are almost always fenced. If there's elephants, like you can rest assured that the people who are working there, like the wildlife managers, know them all by name. They know who has what personality, who they need to keep an eye on, who they don't. It's like all these animals are tagged and their movements, not all, like of course all the ungulates aren't tagged, but there are certain species that like, yeah, just like anywhere else, like they're being monitored and they're being managed because that concept of like pure wild, I think is silly. And early on, like I want to say this was the first or second year of my show, I had a woman on the show named Joe Ruxton, and we had a fascinating conversation. I can't believe I remembered her name just now. I'm usually bad about that. She was like an executive producer or something like that on Blue Planet or like one of those big ocean documentaries, and she felt so kind of guilty after making this gorgeous documentary that was really aspirational that she felt motivated to make another documentary called A Plastic Ocean because she was like, none of those shots are what the ocean actually looks like.
Yeah,
Like they're
it's like
all
nature porn, right? That's what
yeah,
people say.
it's like we just cut it right before the plastic bag floats in. And it's like
Yeah.
that's sort of how like you were mentioning all these shots where there's no telephone cables and there's no people and you're not seeing like the snare the poacher snares and all these things. Like that's not what nature looks like, sadly.
Yeah, I think like in an ideal world, like sure we don't have zoos, but I think that that's just not what we've done, and that's not where we're at right now. And I think that zoos, by and large, can play an important role. But I know some friends of mine and some environmental reporting colleagues who would disagree with me. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I'm
Yeah.
always open to having my mind changed, but so far from what I've seen, the spectacled bear, for example, that was the scientists that I was with were with San Diego Zoo. So, um, yeah, I don't know. So far, I think like
Yeah.
it's a positive. Many zoos can play a really positive role in conservation. So,
Well, and I guess that opens up an important conversation, and I know that you probably didn't expect to be sort of positioned as the expert on this show, but as an environmental reporter and somebody who, especially with bears, has spent a long time really digging deep, what advice might you have for an individual consumer who hasn't thought about this kind of stuff this stuff very much, who either is living in their home country and is like, well, like I might want to take my kids to the zoo, but how do I know which zoo is a good zoo? And how do I know if I'm making good decisions? And maybe beyond that, and mostly I'm asking personally because I'm about to go back to Disney World and I want to make sure it's okay to go to Animal Kingdom. But then you add to that, beyond that, what if you're traveling? How can you make good decisions and about not buying into wildlife tourism that is almost sometimes presented as a conservation effort when it's very clearly not done well?
I feel like you just really have to do your research. I remember hearing about this situation. We're going off bears now, but in I think it's in Thailand with elephants, where like there would be like this like sad kind of like exploitative elephant sanctuary, and people would go and they would feel bad, and they'd be like, "Oh, you can go to like this other like better, nicer one," and it was owned by the same people, right? Like it was like they were intentionally like trying to get people to go to both of them. So I think, by and large, like if you're traveling, avoiding kind of probably any kind of animal tourism, but like really do, for example, like when I was in India, like I went to the sloth bear sanctuaries, like managed by Wildlife SOS, like they're certified charities. You can do, there's a lot of research and media on these places, right? If they're like legit. So I think
Yeah. There are ways, it's like, avoid it in general if you can't do the research, but I think there are ways to do things kind of right. Like I remember one time, I've never done like an animal encounter in a country that I was visiting, because that just worries me. But I remember, where was I? I was at the Wellington Zoo, which is like really well managed. It's like a beautiful, lovely little well managed zoo. And they do, like many zoos, San Diego probably does this too. As part of their conservation efforts, they may do encounters with certain very non-aggressive.
I've been to the Wellington Zoo and they had a red panda encounter.
I didn't do that, but I did like a lemur. I did like a lemur encounter there, and I was like, "Is this bad?" But then I was really like, you sit with these scientists, and they're like, they know everything about these organisms. They know their life story. Oh, he was born here. He's part of this breeding population, and blah blah blah. And like these are his quirks. And when you pay $100 to sit here with him for 20 minutes, that goes towards like all of this conservation stuff. It's like it becomes a hard thing because it's like you want to contribute and you want to help, but you also are a selfish person and you're like, I want to see a lemur up close, which is maybe terrible and gross.
It's so crazy. So I live in London now, and the London Zoo, they have like a lemur house where you can just like walk into it, and the lemurs they're like free roaming. I'm like, wait, what? It's like, a butterfly conservatory where like the butterflies land on you. Like the lemurs are like that. I was like, my mind was blown when I first went to it. I was like, wait, what?
Maybe that's why it's so easy for them to do that in Wellington. And you see it, like obviously in Australia, you're all the kangaroo, like most of the marsupials are just out. Like when you go to like a zoo or something, there's just like a kangaroo hopping around like, and you're like, oh, I guess you're not going to hurt me. So I guess they know the animals, but I don't know, we've gotten way off bears. No, I can't imagine that there's ever a bear encounter. I feel like this would be a scary, dangerous thing.
Let me tell you.
Okay, please do.
And this segues nicely because it brings us to pandas, which we haven't talked about yet.
Oh, right. Pandas. They're kind of chill, or are they not?
They're pretty chill. So I volunteered and this is in the book, but I volunteered as a panda keeper for the day at Dujiangyan Panda Base in Sichuan province. And you basically pay a whole bunch of money and you are basically like the zookeeper for the pandas. And so you're like breaking bamboo, you're cleaning up the panda poop in the enclosure, you're like making panda breakfast. You get to feed a panda through the bars, and then if you want to pay like another like $200, you could have like taken a photo with a panda with like your arm around the panda, like chilling, like for a great like panda moment. My understanding is they've since stopped that. Perhaps
because that promotes bad.
Well, I think it was a COVID concern of the pandas getting COVID, and then I think it was also. There may have been a panda that was like biting people on the ear or something.
Oh my gosh. Well, and also, isn't there this concern where like, even if it's safe in this specific instance, if people see people doing that, then they're going to see a wild panda and go, I can put my arm around this because people are dumb. Well, and so it's like, we don't want to promote those photo ops, do we?
even in the Beijing Zoo, there's been like this one bear named Gugu, and people have like repeatedly jumped into his enclosure because they're like, oh my God, I want to hug the panda. And he like mauls the shit out of them. Like pandas can be pretty aggressive. Like I've actually like part of my research was like Googling like injuries from panda attack. And like it's gruesome. Like
Yeah.
they've got a strong bite force, right? So like these people's legs were like torn up, very gruesome images from jumping and trying to hug a panda. So
Ugh,
don't try
that's
this at home.
bad.
Don't try this at home, folks.
Yeah, like I know a
Yeah.
lot. I have a lot of friends who work in environmental journalism and just science communication in general. And like I think we've all had experiences where we were like sort of lucky enough to be on some sort of tagging mission or to see like a necropsy or to be around like really interesting animal things that you don't often get to do because we were like with the scientists who do them. And many of us might have a photo or two. Like I have a photo of a pangolin. I'm not like hugging it. I'm like at a veterinary clinic where they're like sadly doing surgery on this pangolin that was rescued from a poaching operation. And so I have a picture of this pangolin from afar, but like I do not post pictures like that on my social media. Like
Yeah.
I'm very careful about that because I feel like they can so easily be misunderstood, misrepresented, or promote bad, dangerous behavior.
Yeah, totally. I think it's just that like mindfulness as to how you're presenting things.
Right. Right, because there is a downstream effect, right? So somebody goes and hugs a panda at a place where it's, let's say, perfectly safe and maybe even ecologically conscientious to do it because, like, they paid a shitload of money that goes directly back into conservation efforts. It's still sometimes worrisome because then it's like, oh, look, you can hug a panda
Yeah.
too.
Even, I mean, it's interesting to think about like getting back to the zoo panda thing. So pandas have been bred quite a bit in captivity in China over the last few decades, and they have like hundreds of bears that have been born in China. And then what China does is they send those bears out to zoos around the world, right? So they have these like panda rental agreements where China still owns every single aspect of the bear. Its cubs, its fur, its semen, like any genetic part of the bear China owns. And the zoos, whether they're, the Washington National Zoo in Washington, D.C., or like the Edinburgh Zoo, they have to pay like $1 million per year in like a panda like loaner fee, basically back to China. And so there was issues around this of like kind of exploiting these pandas for
Yeah.
capital gain. And so now it's required that some of that money has to go to wild panda conservation. Although I think it's been like the money tracks there have been a bit vague as to where that money has gone, but it's supposed to help with conservation in the country as well.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'm reading about, of course, like I'm always trying to look at pictures of things while we're talking. So, and I was like confused, but about like the giant, we call them giant pandas. Are there not giant pandas? Or are they all pandas giant pandas?
Well, so I think that terminology comes from the fact that China calls the red panda the lesser panda.
Oh, okay.
Which is actually quite funny when you're going through. It's like giant panda, lesser panda.
I know, it's like so sad. And it is way lesser. Like there's a big difference between the giant panda, which is a bear, and the lesser panda, which is
but
like
both pretty
tiny.
cute. I'm pretty into
Very
red
cute.
pandas, to be honest.
Oh, red pandas are amazing. They're so freaking cute. That's going to be your next book. I know it.
Exactly.
But I'm seeing even on like its Wikipedia page, which, who knows about the accuracy here, but I'm seeing like a whole section called panda diplomacy. And that's really what they're talking about is this like, that pandas used to be given as gifts. Between like China and the West as like cultural exchanges, and then like almost like these licensing fees, and the World Wildlife Federation and Fish and Wildlife like suing. Oh, this is fascinating. There's probably like a whole, I don't know, like suspense thriller category here.
I feel like
and
the panda diplomacy is fascinating. Like the geopolitics of like in constant. It's like the perfect talk, especially as a journalist. Like I love panda diplomacy because it brings together like those really interesting geopolitical relationships plus conservation plus an adorable animal. Like it's just like the perfect story, right? Like it's so fascinating, and I think it'll be interesting to see what happens next with panda diplomacy as China, the economy's in a downturn. They're like turning more inward. Do they care as much about giving pandas to other countries now that they've become a bit more insular post-COVID? I'm excited to see what happens with panda diplomacy in the coming decade.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I'm seeing here that like before some of these weird fee arrangements expired, the panda was sometimes 5 times more expensive than keeping an elephant.
Yeah, I
That
think
doesn't seem right.
I think it's the bamboo. I think like
Wow.
they're such picky eaters, they're like having to get like fresh bamboo because like really expensive in a lot of places.
So why, okay, not why is that? Because I don't know if there is an answer to that question, but like talk to me about that, about pandas and their eating habits, because it does sound pretty fascinating that they're like, you know, I guess maybe that's why some people think of koalas as bears, even though they're not bears, because they have like cute
Mm,
little bear
the
faces. And
eucalyptus.
they're
Yeah.
similar in that way, right? They eat this very like low nutrient food just like all day long.
Yeah, no, it's very true. Yeah, so pandas, like 99% of their diet is bamboo. And within that, like they don't even eat like all the there's tons of species of bamboo. And they only eat like I think it's like 46 of the bamboo species. Like they have like two favorites. So they're like picky within picky within picky. And there's different like theories as to why they want to eat the bamboo. You know, they even have like the thumb that's kind of weird to like hold the bamboo. Like they've evolved,
Right.
they have like this like bamboo thumb. Um and it's not like maybe it's because like they're kind of lazy and they don't want to fight other animals over food, and because none of the other animals like want the bamboo, the panda's just like, well, I'll eat that, like, you know, no conflict to get this food, yum. But yeah, but because of that they also have to eat like just like a ton of it. Like all they do is eat because they have to sit there and like getting enough calories, right? So it's not the most like strategic, you know, food to eat. But at the same time, people always act like pandas are so dumb and like they're so clumsy, but they're the oldest bear lineage. And when you look back, like the ancient panda like actually looks really similar to the modern panda. Like they haven't changed much. And yet
Interesting.
they've persisted, right? Like they persisted through the country that's had the biggest population, you know, only to be surpassed by India this year, and they hung on. So like they're doing something right, you know, like they can't,
Yeah.
I think we have to give the panda credit. So, you know, it's kind of, you know, just derided, but I think obviously there's something going on.
So if you, gosh, we could talk for so long and I can't keep you much longer, but like if you had to look at if you look at the evolutionary lineage of all of these different organisms, you mentioned that the giant panda is sort of the evolutionarily oldest. What are the phylogenetically youngest bears to evolve?
The
Do you
polar
know?
bear. Yeah, it's the polar
Polar
bear.
bear.
The
Okay.
polar bear is the most recent. So basically, this like group of brown bears kind of split off as the ice in the world and all these things were changing, and they went up to like the northern seacoast, and that's kind of like what triggered their evolution to become these like maritime, harsh winter bears. And they also kind of reverse the patterns of the bear. Like they basically eat all winter and starve all summer, right? Which is like the opposite of, you know, bears in most parts of the world. So yeah, it's the polar bear is the youngest. Uh, and I mean, scientists aren't completely sure even when that happened, whether, you know, it was like 1,000,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago. But again, also why they can kind of interbreed too.
Yeah, with brown bears. And so is the idea here that there's probably a common ancestor between the brown bear and the polar bear, or did the polar bear really kind of split off of the brown bear lineage and it is still pretty, I mean, obviously, like you said, they can still breed. So it is kind of like a
I'm trying to
subpopulation of
remember
brown
everything I
bears.
wrote about bear evolution. Bear evolution was like not my forte.
Yeah.
But I seem to recall there was like the five bear. So like the spectacled bear was its own trademarked nose. You know, it's like its own thing. The panda was its own thing, and then the other bears all kind of belonged to like the same grouping of like
Yeah.
Ursivis. So I think
Okay.
that's kind of like how that got started
It's
in terms of
fascinating that they're sort
relation.
of all over the world. Not completely, but they're sort of all over the world. Okay, so the last thing, because we're running out of time, I want to talk a little bit about just like the way that we think of bears, like our sort of popular opinion of bears. You know, bears are these, in some ways, very wild. Certain species, like we talked about, have these kind of stereotypes of being super aggressive. We have to be really careful when we're camping. We have to carry bear spray so that they don't like rip open our cars and steal all of our food, and like, you know, that there's no conflict there. But at the same time, they're like every little kid's first stuffed toy, and there's like a sweetness to them, you know, the teddy bear, the cuddly bear. Like where is that sort of, I don't know, that divergence come from? I don't know, what do you make of that?
I think, yeah, I think it was like that cultural connection that like so really kind of got me from the get-go with this book and this project. You know, and I think the thing that kind of had struck me was why people were so like, people love bears. You know, it's like ranchers, like people everyone like loves bears, but not in the same way that you would see like people talking about wolves, right? And like it's strange because bears can kill people, but like wolves generally don't. And yet there's so much more
Right.
tolerance towards bears.
Well, do you think it's like a reverence for, I mean, I know a wolf can like rip your throat out for sure, but it's also like a dog. There's something about a bear. Bears are just so damn big. I don't know. It's like that, like their stature.
I think it's like they remind us of ourselves. I think that that's like where it comes down to. I think, you know, and I kind of get in, like people once thought that bears were our closest human relative, you know, more so than the primates because they could move on two legs. They're intellectually smart. They're curious. You know, people like those backyard bear videos get at like this deeper kind of like fundamental kernel of truth that like we see ourselves in those bears playing in backyards, right? Like that's why we like those videos. So I think there's like that fondness out of seeing something that reminds us of our own species, you know, and there's all these stories of shapeshifting and humans and bears being one and the same throughout, you know, indigenous stories and mythologies. So yeah, I think that's a critical element. I think, you know, the teddy bear, they're cute. I think too, the stories that we tell. And I think, you know, one of the things that I kind of set about doing was trying to think if I knew any stories that had an evil bear character in them, like child stories.
Oh, right.
And they don't, right? It's the big bad wolf, but Goldilocks, which is like the most famous kind of bear folklore piece, the human is the intruder and like the evil one. Like she's the antagonist, right? And like little wee bear is like, who's been in my chair, you know?
Yeah.
You feel bad for little wee bear. Like this human's coming. Whereas like, you know, Red Riding Hood, the Three Little Pigs, like it's very clear that like the wolf is the bad one. So I think that's we've also kind of reinforced this like benign view of bears through the stories that we've told culturally for like decades. So
yeah,
I think it's
going way back. Like bears obviously have like such a an important place in our culture. I mean, like the most recognizable constellation in the sky, which we think of as the Big Dipper, right? It looks like a spoon to us, but it's Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, the Big and Small Dippers. They're
and
the big bear and the small bear.
The word Arctic actually comes from the word Arctos, which means bear as well. So,
oh wow,
yeah, there's some of these like little like things about bears that, you know, Canada they were going to call Ursalia at one point, meaning place of bears. There's all these like funny like reverence for bears in different ways throughout our culture.
Oh yeah, in California where I live, our state flag is just a bear. Like that's the whole flag is just a bear.
It's the grizzly bear, even though you killed them all.
That's a whole other conversation. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Gosh. And there's of course so much more to this. We only scratched the surface of some of the bears that are the I don't want to say the lesser known bears, but lesser known to the Western readers. And yeah, there's just so much more to dig into. So I've got to ask before we go, because I've already kept you for an hour. Is there anything that there's a million things we didn't talk about, but is there anything we didn't talk about that you're like, no, we can't go until this
I feel like we scratched the surface of everything. Luckily, there's a whole book that gets into all of your thirst for bear knowledge even more. Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about the human connection. We've talked about the bile bears. Yeah, I think we kind of gave a quick drive-by on each species, but obviously, you know, the truth is always more complex, and all of these stories are very, you know, different characters and everything. So yeah, I hope that people have an interest in bears, check the book out, and kind of, I guess, accrue some good bear facts to impress their friends.
Absolutely. Yeah, everybody. The book is 8 Bears, Mythic Past and Imperiled Future by Gloria Dickie. Gloria, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Kara. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and everybody listening, thank you for coming week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.